Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Fascinating to hear about the violins. Oh, thank you. That's the important bit. When my eldest daughter was 7, she decided to take up the violin at primary school. And within a fortnight, every time she lifted the violin case, you'd hear the cat flap in the back door go. And our cat would hightail it up the garden. And for the first few months, the rest of the family was very tempted to follow him. But it did get better. This talk looks at some of the people who have described Western Australia over the centuries and have talked about some of the activities that have gone on here. I've just remembered I need my reading glasses on. Would be better, wouldn't it? There we go. And I'm going to start with a quote which was written in a letter to the Glasgow Courier from HMS Sulphur, moored in Cockburn Sound on the 12th of September 1829, so very soon after colonisation. And the unnamed author wrote, "The Swan River would require the language of a poet to describe it. The scenery is so beautifully, the scenery on its banks is lovely beyond description. Its course is beautifully serpentine." But those who said who came before that correspondent had quite a different view of Western Australia. In 1696, William de Vlaming came up the west coast of Australia and sighted Rottnest. In his journal, he described the island thus: "The ground is covered with little or no soil, but a white and rocky sand, in my opinion, little adapted for cultivation." He went on, "There are very few birds on the island and no animals, except a kind of rat as big as a common cat, whose dung is found in abundance all over the island. There are very few seals or fish, except a sort of sardine and a grey rock bream. In the middle of the island, about half an hour's distance, we found several basins of excellent water, but brackish. And 6 or 7 paces further, a fountain of fresh water right to drink." Not the most complimentary description of Rottnest, I think. This gentleman, William Dampier, was the first Englishman to chart part of the Australian coastline and the first European to undertake a scientific study of its landscape, sea, plants and animals. He spent about 3 months charting the coast between Shark Bay and Lagrange Bay south of Broome. He stopped on several occasions, collecting biological specimens, taking careful scientific notes, and keeping a meticulous diary. He was also unimpressed with the sandy, dry, and barren coast. "The land is low, but seemingly barricaded with a long chain of sand hills to the sea, that lets nothing be seen of what is farther inland. The land by the sea is about 500 or 600 yards of dry, sandy soil, bearing only shrubs and bushes of diverse sorts." Matthew Flinders, who circumnavigated Australia, came to Western Australia, to Cape Lewin, on the 6th of December 1801. He was at the time a 26-year-old sea captain, so he had advanced through the ranks very quickly. On an excursion from the ship moored up in King George Sound on Christmas Eve of that year, Flinders wrote, "The country through which we passed in this excursion has but little to recommend it. Here the country is covered with grass and brushwood, and in parts a little elevated there are forest trees. Nevertheless, the soil is shallow and unfit for cultivation." In the same year, there's King George Sound, in the same year, Nicholas Baudin arrived in his ship with his two ships, Geograph and Naturalist. He was on a scientific exploration, and he looked at the coastline southward from northwards from Cape Lewin, and did a great deal of exploring and looking. And that's why many of the geographical features in the southwest of Western Australia have French-sounding names, because he named them on his expedition. He too was very impressed with our Western Australian coast. He wrote, "The whole western coast of New Holland is described as low, barren, dreary and sandy, affording little interesting in either animal, mineral or vegetable creation." I don't think we'd agree with that today, considering that the southwest is one of the hottest bio-hotspots in the world. Was a little mistaken. He didn't think much of the Swan River either. "The Swan River cannot be considered to meet the requirements of an anchorage. Firstly, at its entrance is very difficult, and its course is too frequently interrupted by sandbanks and shallows. In addition, it is necessary to sail a great distance up the river from the mouth before fresh water is found." Now, Baudin's party went back to France in 1804 with a huge collection of Australian specimens, some of them still alive when they got back to France. Sadly, Baudin died of TB in Mauritius before they got home. But the samples that they took back were divided between the Paris Museum and the Empress Josephine, Bonaparte's wife. And by the summer of 1804, the gardens of Josephine's Paris retreat, Montmaison, were stocked with kangaroos, emus, black swans, and a variety of native plants from Australia. They were the talk of the town, needless to say. Now, given what those and others said of Western Australia in the 17th, 18th and early 19th century, Captain James Stirling, when he visited the Swan River in March of 27 on a reconnaissance mission to see if there was somewhere to set up a colony, must have had his rose-tinted spectacles on, because he wrote of the same place that others had derided, "The richness of the soil, the bright foliage of the shrubs, the majesty of the surrounding trees, the abrupt and red colour banks of the river occasionally seen, and the view of the blue mountains from which we were not far distant, made the scenery of this spot as beautiful as anything of the kind I have ever witnessed." What was he on? He brought with him on that trip the New South Wales colonial botanist Charles Fraser. I'm not convinced he ever got off the boat, but he wrote, "I was astonished at the facility with which water is obtained on this apparently sandy spot, for on digging 2 or 3 feet, we found an abundance of the finest water I have ever tasted." Well, I haven't found it today, but that's another matter. "Here the casuarina disappears and is succeeded by pendulous specimens of Metrosideros," callistemons to us, "which continue to be from the source of the river." And he declared that the floodplain of the Swan River was capital and extremely fertile. Elizabeth and William Shaw emigrated here with their 6 children and arrived in February of 1830. Eliza kept a meticulous diary, and when they arrived and were moored up in Fremantle, it has to be said that their first opinions of this place were not encouraging. I'll let Eliza's diary take up the story. Out of the 1,800 souls now come to this colony in the hopes of living, or at least not being starved to death, there are not a dozen who know what to do or where they are to go. The people here actually look horror-struck at one another in absolute despair. There are some who have been here 9 months and have sown different seeds at different times, but they have all invariably died away, and there is not one who was able to raise potatoes, cabbages, or any other vegetable. The man who reported this land to be good deserves hanging 9 times over. Each side of the river is nothing more or less than sand, white sand, incapable of being made to produce anything for the sustenance of man. And of course, after that, they camped on Bathers Beach in very uncomfortable conditions for about 9 months before they were given an allocation of land. This is Lieutenant Henry Bunbury. He arrived in the colony, and yes, the town down south is named after him. He arrived in the colony in March of 1836. He was sent by Governor Stirling to explore the districts around Williams and Bustleton and establish outposts. As you can tell from a quote in his journal, he was not Perth's favourite fan. Perth itself is a most dismal place, duller than anything you can imagine. But as I came here of my own accord, I have no right to grumble. I think he was a bit of a grumbler. He was not overly impressed also with James Stirling's management style and wrote in his diary, "Not the slightest reliance is to be placed on the governor's word. He changes his mind and his measures 10 times a day, and it is notorious in the colony that except in writing, no promise of his is worth anything." He later wrote, "Sir James Stirling has done the colony a vast deal of harm in many respects, more particularly in representing it to be in such a flourishing state as to induce the home government to put the same price on the land as in the older penal colonies. No emigrants now come here, but disappointed settlers, tradesmen and labourers leave it by every vessel, and more would do the same, did they not have heavy debts and want of money is compelling them to remain." Things did improve and got better, and slowly things sorted themselves out. There's James Stirling, just to remind you. I love this painting done by Charles Whitnome. You can see there's a bushfire going on over somewhere by where UWA is today. They sorted themselves out a little bit, and George Fletcher, who was one of the early lawyers here, wrote a letter to his family back in England on Christmas Eve 1831, and it gives us a bit of an insight into what life was like during the early days of the Swan River colony. He wrote, "There is neither beef, pork, nor flour in the colony now. If a vessel do not soon arrive, the scarcity will be felt severely. We have been expecting ships these last 2 months. There seems to be some magnet at the Cape of Good Hope which detains them." They were totally reliant on supplies from elsewhere because, as Eliza said, they couldn't grow anything here at that time. He then went on, though, to gloat a little bit to his family back in England. What a difference of climate at this time and this hour of the night. With us, the thermometer is 72 degrees, that's Fahrenheit. Perhaps with you, 'tis 30. You are chilled through and before a fire. I am warm, though in a room without windows and sitting without a coat. The English clergyman, the Reverend William Mitchell, arrived in Perth in 1838. He'd been appointed the vicar of All Saints Henley Brook. He and his family arrived in Fremantle in August of 1838, and their eldest child, Annie, who was then 12, described her first impressions in her memoirs. The ship anchored off Garden Island on the 4th of August 1838. After a voyage of 4 months and 3 days, we landed at Fremantle by the ship's boats. The first sight we witnessed was a very large whale lying on the sea beach at Fremantle, from which the natives were cutting large pieces and carrying them away on their spears. The whole of Perth at this time was all deep sand and scrub. There was no road or railway to Perth. All transport was done by water travel. The banks of the Swan River were a mass of green fields and flowers, with everlastings as far as the eye could see. Anthony Trollope, the British author, he of the Barchester Chronicles fame, visited Perth in 1872, and he describes Perth in the following terms. Perth I found to be a very pretty village, built on a lake of brackish water formed by the Swan River. It contains 6,000 inhabitants and, of course, is the residence of the chief people of the colony, as the governor is there, the legislative chamber, and the supreme judge and the bishops. The governor's house is handsome, as is the town hall. The churches, cathedrals I should call them, both of the Protestants and the Roman Catholics, are large and convenient. He then went on to say, on my first arrival, I stayed at an inn, which I did not indeed like very much at first, as the people seemed too well off to care for strangers, but which in its accommodation was better than can be found in many towns of the same size in England. I must acknowledge, however, that I was much troubled by mosquitoes, and did not think the excuse a good one when I was told that a mosquito curtain could not be put up because it was Sunday. He wasn't very impressed with the soil here either. He described the Perth soil as eminently suitable for hourglasses. If you think that's damning, listen to what he said about agriculture here in Western Australia. Atrociously bad. Men continue to crop the same ground with the same crops year after year without manuring it. And when weeds come thicker than corn, they simply leave it. Machinery has not been introduced, seed is wasted, and farmers thresh their corn with flails on the road after the old Irish fashion. He didn't end there. Listen to what he had to say about West Australian wine. I will not take it upon myself to say I drank West Australian wine with delight. I took it with awe and trembling and in very small quantities. But we all know that the art of making wine does not arise in a day. I wonder what he'd think of a Margaret River Red now. I've been forgetting to click on there's Trollope, and there's the town as it was then. We now go to York. By the mid-1890s, of course, with the gold rush and a huge influx of population, Perth was becoming a hothouse of social occasions, so much so that the West Australian newspaper employed a social and fashion correspondent, Cora, Now, try as I might, I haven't been able to find out who that was the nom de plume of, and I'd be very interested to know. She wrote some most entertaining columns, and this is a sample from October of 1892, headed "A Letter from York." Picnics, like cholera, are evidently catching. Yuck. Scarcely have we recovered from the excitement of one than we are accepting invitations for another. The other day, our hosts were the bachelors of York, and brilliantly did they shine. In fact, they were heavenly hosts, at least so the ladies said. We arrived at our destination just a little after midday and found a most appetising lunch awaiting us. After doing full justice to the tempting things provided, and also, I might mention, having our photographs taken by one of our hosts in the midst of the performance, we proceeded to examine the beauties and neighbourhoods. Although the day promised to be most unfavourable, it turned out splendidly, and we reached home without even a moisture. Thanks to the hospitality of our hosts, we wound up the day with a go-as-you-please dance in the Mechanics' Institute, where we disported ourselves until the small hours, everyone apparently regretting that such an enjoyable day must come to an end. And I will end with a quote from... I have been very negligent in my clicking of slides. Sorry about that. A New Yorker visited Perth in 1932 and gave his impressions in an article he sent to the West Australian. They said to me as I boarded the Transcontinental Express, "You won't last more than a few days in Perth. The town is dull. The people are provincial. There will be nothing of interest for you. There will be no escape from yourself. You will literally perish of ennui. We'll be waiting for you in Sydney." He then went on, "They're still waiting for me in Sydney. I have miraculously survived 3 months of Perth. It has been a real effort, but life is sweeter for it. Loafing is an art, with a technique of its own, like the writing of poetry, and not easily acquired." He went on, "Perth is a city in which to linger, to slacken one's pace, to observe strictly the conventional interludes of morning and afternoon tea, to find for one and more often several quiet spots, if so inclined, and above all, to exchange pointless queries about the weather." That, ladies and gentlemen, is how others have seen Western Australia.